Today, we'll follow the Mary Celeste's final voyage, step aboard the ship she left behind, examine the investigation that followed, and uncover why her mystery still refuses to be explained. In December of 1872, a ship was found drifting alone in the Atlantic Ocean. No distress signals, no damage from a storm, no sign of a struggle. When rescuers boarded the vessel, everything looked normal. The cargo was still secured, the crew's personal belongings were untouched, even the captain's log had been carefully written, its final entry dated 10 days earlier. But the 10 people who had sailed aboard her, Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their young daughter, and 7 crew members, were gone. Not missing, not injured, gone. The ship was called the Mary Celeste, and for more than 150 years, no explanation has fully survived scrutiny. Today's story is not about myths or sea monsters, at least not yet. It's about evidence, human behavior, and a decision so sudden that an entire crew abandoned a perfectly seaworthy ship in the middle of the ocean. So what happened aboard the Mary Celeste, and why does this mystery still refuse to let go? Let's begin. To understand what happened aboard the Mary Celeste, we have to start with how ordinary her journey was supposed to be. On November 7th, 1872, the Mary Celeste departed from New York Harbor. Her destination? Genoa, Italy. Her cargo was 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, valuable, volatile, and tightly sealed. At the helm was Captain Benjamin Briggs, 37 years old, highly experienced, known among his peers as cautious, deeply religious, and meticulous. This was not a desperate man chasing a risky payday. Briggs had commanded ships for years. He trusted this vessel. He trusted it enough to bring his own family. Traveling with him were his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. Their young son, Arthur, stayed behind with relatives, a decision that would later haunt every retelling of this story. The crew was carefully chosen, 7 men, all seasoned sailors. No reports of conflict, no history of mutiny, no reason to believe this voyage would be anything other than routine. Before departure, Captain Briggs wrote to his mother. In the letter, he spoke of the ship's condition, calling her seaworthy and reliable. He mentioned nothing about fear, nothing about danger. The Mary Celeste left port behind schedule. Weather slowed her progress, but nothing unusual was recorded. And then, on November 25th, the ship's logbook makes its final entry. It noted her position, described the weather as calm, and had adjusted her sails. After that, nothing. For 10 days, the Mary Celeste continued to drift across the Atlantic until another ship crossed her path. On December 5th, the British vessel De Gratia spotted her. From a distance, the Mary Celeste looked wrong. She wasn't responding to signals. Her movements were erratic. She seemed unattended. When sailors climbed aboard, they expected trouble. What they found was something far worse: silence. The question wasn't whether something had gone wrong. It was when and why no one had time to explain it. When the crew of the De Gratia finally climbed aboard the Mary Celeste, they expected to find damage or death. Instead, they found something far more unsettling. The entire ship was empty. Not wrecked, not looted, just abandoned. The sails were partially raised, some rigging was tangled, but the vessel itself was still seaworthy, taking on a small amount of water, but nothing an experienced crew couldn't manage. Below deck, the scene felt frozen in time. The crew's personal belongings were still in their chests, clothing neatly folded, pipes, tools, and navigation instruments undisturbed. There were no signs of a fight, no blood, no weapons out of place. In the captain's quarters, Captain Briggs's belongings remained, his clothing, his Bible, even his valuables. Nothing suggested theft or piracy. But there were details that didn't sit right. The ship's lifeboat was gone. Not damaged, not loose. It was missing entirely. A length of rope hung from the ship's side, frayed as though it had been hastily cut or worn through by strain. The ship's chronometer and sextant were gone as well, essential tools for navigation. Whoever left the Mary Celeste hadn't fled blindly. They had prepared to go somewhere. In the hold, inspectors found the alcohol cargo largely intact, but 9 barrels were empty. At the time, this raised fears of leakage or worse. Industrial alcohol fumes were dangerous, highly flammable, invisible. If vapors had built up below deck, Captain Briggs may have feared an explosion. A temporary evacuation would have made sense, but temporary evacuations aren't meant to become permanent. Then there was the logbook. The final entry was dated November 25, 1872. Weather conditions were listed as fair. The ship's position placed her closer to land than she had been for much of the voyage. There was no mention of danger, no emergency, no reason to abandon ship. And yet, sometime after that entry, every person aboard stepped into the lifeboat and was never seen again. The Mary Celeste had not been claimed by the sea. It had been left behind. Under maritime law, an abandoned ship isn't a miracle, it's a legal problem. When the Dei Gratia brought the Mary Celeste into Gibraltar on December 13, 1872, the crew expected a salvage reward. Instead, they were treated like suspects. Authorities launched a formal inquiry, not into the fate of the missing crew, but into the men who found the ship. Leading the investigation was Frederick Solly Flood, Gibraltar's Attorney General. Flood believed the case wasn't a mystery, but a crime. He focused on Dei Gratia's captain, David Morehouse, who had known Benjamin Briggs personally. To Flood, that connection suggested motive. Flood's theory was simple, that the Dei Gratia's crew had killed those aboard the Mary Celeste and staged the ship to appear abandoned. But the evidence didn't cooperate. There was no blood, no stolen cargo, no bodies, and no sign of a struggle. Still, Flood pressed on. Normal wear on the ship, scratches, rust stains, a damaged rope, was presented as evidence of violence. Later analysis would show these marks were routine for ships at sea, but suspicion lingered. The inquiry dragged on for weeks. The Dei Gratia's crew were detained in Gibraltar, their pay withheld, their reputations questioned. In the end, Flood couldn't prove murder. No charges were filed. The salvage reward was sharply reduced, citing unexplained circumstances, a diplomatic way of saying, "We don't trust you." Captain Morehouse and his men were cleared, but never fully vindicated. As for the Mary Celeste, her story didn't end there. She changed owners repeatedly, earned a reputation as unlucky, and eventually was destroyed deliberately in an insurance fraud off the coast of Haiti. But none of that answered the question that mattered most: what happened to the people who vanished? Once the investigation failed to deliver answers, theories rushed in to fill the silence. Some were grounded in evidence, while others were fueled by fear, imagination, and the open sea's long history of superstition. In this chapter, we'll separate what the evidence shows from what speculation added later, examine the leading theories by historical credibility, and trace how one famous writer helped transform the Mary Celeste into a maritime mystery, into a legend. The first theory was due to alcohol fumes and the fear of explosion. This is the explanation most modern historians consider the most credible. The Mary Celeste was carrying more than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. When the ship was found, 9 of those barrels were empty. Unlike solid cargo, alcohol can leak, it can evaporate, and in a poorly ventilated hold, it can release dangerous fumes. Alcohol vapor is invisible. It has little to no smell, and under the right conditions, it's highly explosive. Captain Benjamin Briggs would have known this. The leading theory suggests that alcohol fumes may have built up below deck, possibly accompanied by a sudden loud bang, not a fire, but something alarming enough to convince Briggs that an explosion was imminent. His response may have been meant as a temporary precaution. Lower the lifeboat, secure it with a rope, wait until the danger passed. But if that rope failed, or the weather suddenly worsened, the lifeboat could have drifted away, leaving the Mary Celeste to continue sailing on her own. No violence, no madness, just a fatal miscalculation. The second theory was navigational error and abandonment near land. The final log entry placed the ship closer to land than she actually was. If Captain Briggs believed he was near the Azores, abandoning ship may have seemed survivable, even reasonable. But the Atlantic is unforgiving. A small lifeboat carrying 10 people, including a young child, would not have lasted long in open water. This theory aligns with Briggs's cautious personality, but it still requires a catastrophic decision made with incomplete information. Another theory was the sudden change of weather or waterspouts. Some have suggested the crew encountered a sudden storm or a waterspout, violent enough to cause alarm, but brief enough to leave little physical evidence. The problem is that there's no recorded weather event matching that scenario, and the ship herself shows no damage consistent with a forced abandonment caused by extreme conditions. It's possible, but it's weakly supported. Other theories like mutiny and piracy were both suggested early on, but both fail for the same reason: no blood, no stolen cargo, and no explanation for why anyone would leave a ship that was still fully capable of sailing. In 1884, more than a decade after the incident, a young writer named Arthur Conan Doyle published a short story titled J. Habakkuk Jephson's Statement. The story was fiction, but it read like fact. Doyle changed names, invented details, and framed the narrative as a first-person confession. Many readers believed it was real. The story introduced dramatic flourishes, bloody conflicts, sinister motives, exotic villains, none of which existed in the historical record. But the damage was done. From that point on, the Mary Celeste was no longer just a mystery, it was a ghost ship. What makes the Mary Celeste unsettling isn't that we don't have answers, it's that the most likely explanation is painfully human. No monsters, no curses, just fear, judgment, and a decision made at sea that could never be undone. The Mary Celeste doesn't haunt us because of what we don't know. It haunts us because of what we might. A captain making the safest choice he could, a crew trusting that decision, and the sea offering no second chances. There was no monster, no final scream, just a small boat and silence. And every time this story is told, it asks the same quiet question: what would you have done? Thank you for watching.